Today in Agronomy on KFIL AM 1060 with Pioneer Field agronomist Allie Wise and Josh Schaffner. Here's Josh and Allie.
Good morning, Southeast Minnesota. Today is June 30th. Josh, this is episode number 75. So a lot to talk about on today's show as we kind of enter the midway point of this growing season. Hard to believe, especially still sitting here at the end of June, but certainly things are progressing pretty quick throughout the area. I think, it's been really interesting. It feels like throughout this whole growing season, we've kind of just been hanging on by a thread. I don't know if that's a good analogy to use. And certainly it felt that way before we got this nice stretch of rain that varied in amounts between east of 52 and west of 52. But nice to capture some rain over these last couple of days. So just maybe an update on where we're sitting GDU-wise and precipitation-wise.
Yeah, it was kind of a great week here. A little bit different week, GDU accumulation. We had a little bit of a cool down from kind of the big heat swing we've had. And then we also picked up some rain across the area, which was great to see. Starting with the GDUs, kind of where we're sitting right now across the area, just kind of averaging up all the locations we're monitoring. We're kind of sitting right around that 960 is where we're at. So really knocking on the door of 1,000. We'll probably be there well before the end of this week. We'll get to the 1,000 mark, which is great. And when you start thinking about that GDU accumulation of where we're at, I mean, Allie, you and I were out in some corn yesterday, and I'm 6'4" tall, and corn was right up to the top of my head, so getting pretty tall. And if you kind of pair that to GDU wise, a lot of our 102 day hybrids need about 1,250 to get to tassel, so we're getting pretty close. Kind of just playing that forward, we're probably 10 to 14 days, just depending on where you're at. From seeing some tassels. And in some cases, if we did plant a little bit of early corn right out of the gate, we could be a little ahead of that. So that's a great place to be. But yeah, talking about this mature of corn still in the month of June is great to see. And, rainfall varied, quite greatly across the listing area. Kind of some of the locations we're monitoring, it ranged from 3.17 and in some cases all the way down to 0.64. And I think that probably covered a lot of the area. With that said, there might have been a few little areas that had a little bit more than rain than that. And we also picked up here a little bit more, I think, in between our monitoring. So we might be able to add a little bit to that from when this was put together. But much needed rain, Allie. Like you said, we were kind of hanging on by a thread. We need this precipitation. But really great amount picked up. And in most cases, the ground took it really well. And now we're kind of sitting really good as we head into pollination season.
Yeah, and I think, just a follow-up there, we've had a lot of questions on, we know we've been dry, but really the crop has held in relatively well, and in terms of what we maybe lost, always tough to say for certain, but I really don't think we lost much yield potential throughout this stretch. I think we're doing okay so far, and certainly a tremendous amount of potential sitting in these fields across the listening area. Certainly that varies from field to field, but overall, general statement, things are looking pretty good, which is great to see. Did just want to jump into, before we maybe talk about corn rootworm observations, just some general corn roots in general prior to this rain coming into the profile. It's interesting that we're saying this, but we did start to see some sidewall compaction, kind of some hatchet roots, which would have been the last thing that one would have expected considering the conditions that we planted into, Josh.
Yeah, I started digging some roots last week, for two reasons. Number one, I was just trying to get a gauge of how root development has been. And then we're kind of rolling into corn rootworm season, which we'll talk about here a little bit as well. But, one thing last week is out walking fields and had the spade out and digging some roots was, the first one I was actually on a service call. They actually thought they might have had some feeding from black cutworm, which actually it turned out to be some rootless corn syndrome. But the one thing is I was out digging some plants was that in a lot of fields, and this really doesn't matter if it's no-till or conventional tillage, once your spade's getting down there 3.5, 4 inches, it just seems like we just hit a brick, just very hard ground below that. And then once you dig some roots out, you kind of see the same thing, like you mentioned with the sidewall, just extremely hard. And in some cases, roots were struggling to get through that. You see the hatchet or the mohawk roots. Root depth, it was getting down there, but just a very narrow root zone. And in some cases, usually when we talk about sidewall, we're kind of concerned about what was the planting conditions. Did we plant too wet? Allie, in this case, I don't think we planted too wet. Just some factors of really mellow soil when we planted, followed by that hard rain to level the crusting. I think once we had that rain, that fine soil, it just kind of turned to some of our clay soils into kind of just pottery, just really turned into a brick from what we can tell.
Yeah, so it's really interesting. And again, opposite of what we would think. But like you'd mentioned, we've actually come across this because we're out in fields monitoring for rootworm feeding. So certainly we don't want to ever talk about this until it's time to start looking, but it is time to start monitoring for feeding. So really, focus items for us. We're really targeting some of that long-term continuous corn for rootworm larvae and feeding. We've had some heavy larva counts, depending on what the management practices look like from field to field. Knowing that this winter likely didn't knock out populations back much, and we didn't have any major rains that would have flooded out any of that egg hatch. So it's really important to be monitoring any long-term fields now, and also trapping later this year to know what we need to do next year. But Josh, I know, certainly as you get east of 52, corn rootworm can be a touch more prominent due to rotation. Any comments that you want to add there?
Yeah, all good points. And then we've had concern about corn rootworm kind of coming into the season here, just based off, like you mentioned, the population increase followed by the mild winter. I'm up against a break here, Allie. When we come on a break, we'll talk about what we're seeing for corn rootworm pressure and talk about some of the feeding, and also talk about some of the scouting methods to use a grower, what you can be looking for here the next 14 days. Welcome back, Southeast Minnesota. Allie, we kind of got up against the break there just as we're getting into our corn rootworm conversation there. We kind of mentioned, some of the root development challenges that we're seeing as a result of kind of the soil conditions and kind of that really hot and dry weather we encountered in June. Kind of something we stumbled across as we're maybe out there starting to look for some corn rootworm activity. And obviously, especially as we get east of 52, where we got a little bit higher percentage of corn on corn acres, we've been concerned. And in some cases, Allie, where we knew we had some high pressure last year based on trapping, where we knew we got corn again, we did some training here this week and dug some roots, and activity seemed really high based on what we observed across Southeast Minnesota here, based on some of the fields we targeted.
Yeah, so like we said, I think, action item is just to scout and understand what that pressure looks like. Certainly it depends on the scenario of your field. We had a few scenarios where maybe a lesser treated version was put accidentally on a corn field, had an application of Lorazban, and had significant root feeding that, should the wrong wind event come through, it could be a bad situation. We had another situation where there was a double version of a product on a field with force, and it was really interesting to see the differences between the two. A lot of active larva feeding on both, but the control from the force was certainly more positive than what we saw from the other scenario. So, just taking an eye on some of those differences between the two, spending some time in your cornfields, helping us to know what to look, or give us a call if you need help knowing what to look for too. But I think something to consider is just thinking about what could this look like from an adult management standpoint, should we see a lot of feeding in these fields, Josh?
Yeah, for sure. And I think the action item, and I know, we're all probably guilty, Allie, that we maybe this time of year don't walk our cornfields as much as we could. But I think any producer that has some corn on corn, you don't got to go crazy or go hiking, miles and miles, but getting out in cornfields and maybe just grabbing 4 or 5 root balls and Allie, I think you can do this in field. I think just taking a look at, get that plant dug up good. And I don't think you got to go through all the work of hauling them home, taking water, wash them unless you find something. We're just looking for active larvae activity. And Allie, where we had pressure, it wasn't hard to find them. We could find them right in the field, dig the root up, shake some of the dirt off, take a look, and you can see if they're active. And we could see the feeding pretty easily. So that's a good action item just to scout for. But obviously, if we're seeing a lot of larvae feeding, and if we know that, hey, number one, I'm seeing enough larvae that, maybe I'm seeing 10, 12 larvae a plant, which we saw some of that during our training. Allie, that could be something where, hey, we're going to have a lot of beetles that could impact silk feeding along the way too, that if I am going to do a fungicide tassel, maybe, adding insecticide to control adult beetles. The other side of that, Allie, even if we know that farm is targeted for corn on corn again next year, regardless, it could be a great way to add insecticide just to try to manage that population, year after year as well, which that can be a great management tool, not a cure-all, but it is, you look at best management practices of managing population, adult beetle control, a fungicide can be a great way to try to knock a few beetles out along the way.
Yeah, so we've got a couple more weeks of feeding here, I would say. So just get out there, let us know where we can help as well, from a corn rootworm perspective, and just kind of setting the expectations of where our fields might be sitting.
And a lot of the larvae were probably, I'm going to guess, between 1/8 and 1/4 inch long, so very easy to find. And we were using kind of some black trash bags just to kind of, as we were shaking dirt off, we could see a little bit easier. That could be, taking something like just a black little bag or something out there with you. It could be a great scouting method to go out there and see if you can see some active larvae in your corn on corn fields.
Yeah. So kind of moving on from corn rootworm into the fungicide side of things, hard to believe that we're having that discussion already. But Josh, from a soybean perspective, staging wise, depending on which planting date you got in on with your soybeans, yesterday we were out in some fields and we actually found some soybeans that were sitting at R2 stage. So we're getting really close to thinking about making some of those soybean fungicide applications. And really, certainly want to get your take, but my opinion on soybean fungicide, timing is everything. So really want to make sure we're focused on hitting the R3 stage in soybeans when we think about making those applications, to really have the most positive return on our investment there. Any additional thoughts?
Yeah, for sure. It kind of, the bean crop looks really great. The beans have really taken off here. And I know we were looking at some early planted beans yesterday, Allie, and some stuff that, pretty good growing conditions where this was at. But yeah, they were knee high. So very big beans, like you said, all of R2. And we anticipate those to probably get to R3 in the next 7 or so days, which that'll trigger that timing you mentioned. And when it comes to soybean fungicide, there's really, I'm not going to make any varietal decisions or certain, growing conditions. I'm really just going to target, hey, if we can nail that R3 timeframe, I'm going to go ahead and probably suggest growers to do that. We've seen really good return with those applications across the board. And but you got to hit that window. You start missing that. You want to hit that R3 to R4. If you're too early, too late, we see diminishing returns really fast on that. And the other side of it is, it's just what a great situation to have beans at this stage and still the month of June. If we can put fungicide on them, extend that growing season, we have the whole month of July and August and early September to harvest sunlight on these. And, that's really what really drives bean yields is, can we get to canopy really fast? And then at that point, can we keep them healthy and basically just let those leaves do what they do best, just act as solar panels and punch on yield. But, there can still be challenges. Still got to think about, the rain and white mold, other things. But just in a great position on the soybeans. And the other part of it, Allie, to kind of close out the show, corn fungicide decisions are coming up on us too.
Yeah, corn fungicides, I'd say the next 10, 14 days, we could be looking at making those applications. So as we come back to next week's show, we'll be sure to dig a little deeper into what this growing season and the yield potential may mean for return on investment of corn fungicides.
You've been listening to Today in Agronomy on KFIL AM 1060. If you've missed part of the show or want to hear more, check out the show page at kfilradio.com or with the 103.1 KFIL app. Stay connected with Allie and Josh on Twitter. It's at Allie GYs, WISE, and at Josh Schaffner to submit your questions for the show. Tune in next Wednesday for the next Today in Agronomy on KFIL AM 1060.